Thank you all for coming. I think what we're going to learn is the limits of my understanding. There was a little bit, I think the sentence you said needs some interpretation, which is that I'm not an expert at all on, I may be an expert on walkable cities, I'm not an expert on autonomous vehicles. And that's a funny story that I want to share with you. This talk started as the same title, but 10 rules for mayors. And I was asked to give you essentially the same talk that I gave to the mayors. And the story is that I'm friends with Mick Cornett. And Mick Cornett has been for many years the mayor of Oklahoma City. And I got to know him at the Mayor's Institute on City Design. And Mick, right after he left the Institute and after I left the NEA, right after he left that institute and I left the NEA, Oklahoma City was named the worst city for walking in the entire country by Prevention magazine, because this is what the streets look like. And he said, what do we do? And I said, let's do a walkability study. And he said, what's that? And I said, I don't know. I've never done one yet, but I'd really like to do one. And I'd like to do one in Oklahoma City. And through the course of that walkability study, one thing led to another. Devon Energy was building a huge new tower in the downtown of Oklahoma City. And that was generating a couple $100 million in tax increment. And they said, what can we do with this money? And a bunch of us said, let's rebuild every street in the downtown core from building face to building face. And if you do this work that we new urbanists do, most of the time, the smart thing to do is to restripe, right? Reconfigure, don't rebuild. Because you can restripe a whole downtown for the price of rebuilding one street. But in fact, they had the money to rebuild the whole downtown. So that's what they did. And a typical street went from this, sorry. Oh, I ruined the fade. Let me do that again. So it went from this to this. It got worse, just kidding. It went from this to this. I forgot that I had plugged a fade in here for the mayors. I don't do fades for the designers. They think it's too smooth. So we did this, and we got to know each other, and we developed a relationship that continued. And at a certain point, he said, Jeff, I want you to address a plenary at the U.S. Conference of Mayors, a couple hundred mayors at the winter meeting. And I said, that's great. And I prepared my very best walkability talk, because mayors need to hear about walkability. And what happened was about a month before the event, he called me up and said, Jeff. And I'm like, okay, yeah. He's like, what's the catch? He goes, we still want you to do the talk, but the mayors all want to hear about autonomous vehicles. That's what that's what everyone's talking about. So I really scrambled and talked to friends, most of whom I know through CNU, and I talked to a lot of you, but the ones I talked to the most were Paul Moore and Jarrett Walker, who are probably familiar to both of you, and they really helped me with this talk. But I don't know much more. As you're going to learn from the Q&A, I don't know much more about autonomous vehicles than is in this talk. As I was preparing this, I gave a Ford-sponsored TED Talk at the Detroit Auto Show. And the highlight there was I got to pick the brains of these two people, Jim Hackett and Laura Merling, because we had a dinner together. And they're the two people who were in charge of the AV effort at Ford. And what I saw over that dinner were two leaders with a profound sense of corporate responsibility who want to see their technology have the best positive impact on America and on the world. But I kept asking the same question: what is the value proposition for cities and for mayors? And it was really a hard question for them, and for me, for all of us, to answer. It's clear that Ford's trying to do the right thing. But as I hope to make clear in the next 25 minutes, it is not going to be easy for them or for us. If the city with AVs is to be better than the city without them, then there's a lot of work to be done. In a sense, this talk is speculative fiction, but we city planners and transportation planners have been talking about this for a number of years now. And with the help of Jarrett and Paul and others, I've come up with these 10 rules that I think are likely to be essential if we're all to benefit from this technology. My rule number 1 is be afraid. One of my favorite books of all time is by the philosopher Neil Postman. It's called Technopoly, The Surrender of Culture to Technology. Who's read this book? You all? Okay, nobody's read this book. Let me tell you about it. In it, Postman describes what he calls the technological imperative. What it means, at least to me, is this. New technologies that increase convenience are unstoppable. You've probably heard of the technological imperative, right? Whatever their impact on long-term quality of life, if they increase convenience, they're unstoppable. It happened with our cars. Enthusiastic adoption followed by some dubious outcomes. These include the doubling of the percentage of our incomes that we spend on transportation, to travel no faster in cities than we used to with a horse and buggy, the impending drowning of our coastal cities, now occasional and eventually permanent, the transformation of so much of the American public realm into an unmitigated soul-sucking eyesore, the mortification of our bodies through inactivity brought on by the elimination of the useful walk, the loss at last count of 40,000 American lives each year in car crashes. None of this was planned, but the technology won, and it will win again. This last item represents for us, I think, the key argument in favor of AVs. If adopted en masse, they will save hundreds of thousands of lives. So many, in fact, that the organ transplant industry is worried. Additionally, we can expect that a lot of urban land, so much of it will be made available for other uses, since we will no longer need as much parking. You will no longer need to pay your parking fee before existing. That seems to have no downside. But as I will try to show, these two positives can be offset very quickly if we're not careful. That leads to rule number 2, be realistic, which I'm also calling what to expect when you're expecting AVs. And it reminds us that major change is unlikely to happen within a decade or several. Notice even, that was for the mayors, not on your watch. Notice even in this image, which is the image that Ford uses to push its AV vision. It's talking about decades and decades from now. See that? Other industry experts think that full autonomy actually won't happen at all. And that's a problem because most of the benefits of AVs only really kick in once we have full autonomy, a swarming fleet of shared vehicles that operates as a public good. This challenge was well described by Robb, the founder of Zipcar, who describes autonomy as a heaven or hell scenario. Heaven is fleets of shared electric driverless cars powered by renewable energy, and a more socialist, that's what I call it, a more socialist wealth redistribution system to help all the drivers put out of work by them. Hell, on the other hand, is privately owned AVs that, since they have nowhere to park, spend much of the day circling, doubling the traffic load. Now, I'm only 53, but I've been an American long enough to know that a fleet of publicly owned AVs does not constitute freedom. We have shown at the national, state, and local levels absolutely zero propensity to control how people buy or use their cars. European cities like Barcelona might create large car-free zones or close 2/3 of their streets to through traffic. Not even New York City, if you'll remember, was able to pull off something as minor as congestion-based toll pricing. Remember that? In terms of ownership, do you actually think someone is going to tell that arrogant prick from the Cadillac EV commercial, remember him, that he can't have his own AV and take it wherever he wants, whenever he wants? I don't. So suddenly, swarming becomes almost impossible, and this dude can still run his Mercedes through Des Moines at Mach 2.5, even if he's slaloming AVs all the way, which he very well might hit. So perhaps the lives saved by AVs may be fewer than anticipated. A realistic understanding of what AVs are likely to mean in America leads to many of the rules that follow, including rule number 3, decide how much traffic you want. This is probably the key rule because a simple understanding of economics makes it hard to avoid reaching the conclusion that AVs will result in a ton more driving. If they cut the cost of driving by 80% as anticipated, that's supposed to add 60% more trips to city streets that are already at capacity. That's what has got Mayor Bloomberg up in arms and pointing the way towards a lot of regulation, intervention, and new policy to avert disaster. But actually, it's worse than 60% for a number of reasons. The biggest one is called induced traffic, or the fundamental law of congestion. If you ignore induced demand, 60% more trips is not a problem as long as we have swarming. Elon Musk tells us that a driving lane full of swarming AVs can handle 3 times as many cars as it does today. So problem solved, until you realize that these days traffic congestion is the principal constraint to driving. Because driving is already so subsidized, we do it as much as we can unless we are punished by traffic. Induced traffic is why highway expansions never work, and if you've been coming to the CNU for any length of time, you know about this completely. Most mayors don't know about this completely. Traffic engineering theory is straightforward. A street is congested because the number of drivers, shown in yellow, exceeds its capacity. If you enlarge the street, you will theoretically eliminate congestion. Unfortunately, what happens instead is that the number of drivers quickly increases to match the increased capacity, and congestion returns in full force. These are the drivers who are taking transit, carpooling, commuting off-peak, or simply not driving because they didn't want to be stuck in traffic. When the traffic went away, they changed their habits. Maybe they even moved further away from work as the time cost of their commute went down. Unfortunately, thanks to them and others like them, it couldn't last. This law applies to city streets as well as to highways, and is particularly bad in third world countries where the poor have lots of time and the rich have drivers so they can get stuff done while in traffic. This becomes especially alarming when we realize that AVs will make driving cheaper in 2 ways, money and time. You will pay less per mile, and you won't mind sitting in gridlock as you work or watch cat videos. What to do about this huge likely increase in vehicles? The only answer, I believe, is to regulate it, and I want to talk about this with you, Aaron, is to regulate it not with laws but with lanes. Without a commitment to limiting capacity, all of our parking lanes, soon empty, will not become bike lanes and greenways as were promised, but more driving lanes, and sidewalks will feel miserable with those cars rushing by. The right solution is to make the streets what you want them to be. Since cars will be more efficient, you can commit to no increase in driving lanes, maybe even get rid of a bunch. You can convert parking lanes to bike lanes and to express bus lanes, which will still be needed as the AVs reach their natural state of equilibrium, which we know from the law of induced traffic will be congestion. Making the streets we want was a hallmark of the Bloomberg administration fade, where Jeanette Sadiq-Khan oversaw the creation of an amazing bike network and many great public spaces by putting driving lanes to better use. This is what Mayor Bloomberg means when he says, "The battle is to create a space in which the question is not how we get ready for self-driving cars, but rather what kind of city we want." Rule 4 is the other natural outcome of cheaper cars, which is plan for more sprawl pressure. I recently saw this kiosk in Boston's Copley Square, and my heart skipped a beat. Here was a Lyft ad, ostensibly for last-mile service, complementing our rail network. But I'll be darned if it wasn't an exact map of suburban sprawl. Now, I've been fighting sprawl for a quarter century with limited success, and everyone knows that it's a function of 4 main factors: highways, mortgage programs, local subsidies, and racism, but mostly highways. Before the car, land development was mostly nodal, mostly around rail stops, and therefore walkable. Only with the car did the entire landscape become equivalent, and development began to take the wasteful, unwalkable, disconnected forms that now, more than anything else, characterize American life. But there is recent good news, if learning that you have a crippling disease can be called good news, which is that cities and towns have begun to figure out that sprawl does not pay for itself. As many of you with sprawling cities can attest, the tax revenue from low-density sprawl is not enough to replace roads and pipes once they fail. And of course, this is the message of Strong Towns and Chuck Marohn, another CNU ally. For this reason, we can hope that the next great inducement to national sprawl, cheap autonomous vehicles, will not have as great an impact as universal car ownership did. But this is only a hope, which is why this may be the one category where policy is the most needed. Given national and state-level tendencies, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, this policy can mostly only happen at the local level, which is why I would direct you not only to CNU, but to Smart Growth America, which is the nonprofit agency that's probably the best resource for sprawl control policy. Rule number 5, understand transit geometry. You're going to hear a little Jarrett Walker here. It has come to the attention of many of us in this business that most of the discussion around AVs seems to adhere to only some of the laws of physics. What is often misunderstood is simple geometry. How many people fit in a vehicle? Even if they swarm and are small, AVs are cars, and since they'll be used by Americans, most can be expected to hold only one rider. Famous images to all of us. Here are 200 people and 177 cars. They fill the street to the horizon. Here they are on bikes, and here they are on buses, and here they are on a streetcar. There's no getting around the fact that low occupancy vehicles are a tremendous waste of street space. It does not matter if the vehicle is conventional, electric, or autonomous. Geometry still prevails. This is why when the Brooklyn Bridge was converted, this is a fascinating statistic, when the Brooklyn Bridge was converted from part rail to all car in 1948, it went from carrying 400,000 people per day to carrying only 170,000 people per day. It's why a single New York L train carries as many people as 2,000 cars per hour, and an articulated bus equals 100 cars. Autonomous cars are a great supplement to transit, but in congested places, they are not a solution to transit. This is why Ford is also investing in autonomous buses, which leads to rule number 6, don't rob transit. This may be the greatest risk. In congested cities, replacing trains and buses with autonomous cars will cripple mobility. Now, if you're a city with no congestion and a very small transit population, AVs may present a solution. If you're Davenport, Iowa, my wife's hometown, moving your transit investment into a voucher system may make sense. But if you're Des Moines, or even Iowa City, it does not. If you're Seattle, it most definitely does not. Unfortunately, just the prospect of future AVs is already threatening transit investment in certain American cities. Maybe you've heard these stories. The Mountain View City Council just voted down dedicated BRT lanes in El Camino Real, due in part, this is what they were talking about at the hearing, of AVs making buses obsolete. The Michigan Taxpayers Alliance, which is another word for the Michigan Don't Pay Taxes Alliance, and others are picking up on AVs and Uber as the last great weapon to finally kill transit. Even DC's Metro is threatened. Meanwhile, Uber, unlike Lyft, has set its sights on transit and is offering Uber Pool monthly memberships at lower cost than a transit pass. Some say to put the conventional transit out of business. Uber admits that this pricing is well below cost and unsustainable, which is by definition predatory. As city leaders, mayors have responsibility to teach their citizens about geometry, to teach them what even Elon Musk doesn't seem to know, which is that a shift from transit to AV cars represents a reduction in mobility. And this is when the guy from Uber got up and stormed out of the room. I was later told by the elevator that some 20-something in their office made this ad and put it up without approval, so they're not taking credit for it. But I got a picture of it, so it counts. So this is already this is already happening with ride-hailing services in terms of reduced mobility. A recent study in Colorado revealed a number of disappointing facts. The first of those was that more than a fifth of Uber and Lyft trips were coming from transit. The second was that ride-sharing trips were producing an additional 64% more traffic than if they'd been accomplished with private vehicles. That's the surplus represented by the 100 miles of car traffic it takes to move people 60.8 miles. AVs threaten to create this condition on steroids. Rule 7, own the streets and own the data. It sounds implausible, but there's a very real worry that AV providers will ask to buy certain city streets or certain segments of certain city streets, and the cities will take the money. This has precedents, like Chicago leasing its on-street parking to Morgan Stanley for 75 years. And these decisions are all regretted. We need to remember that your city streets are its principal public spaces, and especially downtown. They perform many more jobs than just moving vehicles. They are places to walk, bike, access buildings, dine, converse, grow trees, protest, and much more, and they belong to us all. I particularly like this recent quote from Adam Gopnik in The New Yorker. Cities are their streets. Streets are not a city's veins, but its neurology, its accumulated intelligence. We mustn't sell that. Getting more wonky for a minute, the other big issue on ownership, already a big deal, has to do with all the traffic data collected by Uber, which cities can benefit from in many ways, for example, knowing where to send a fire truck. Jeanette Sadiq-Khan is one of many who take issue correctly with Uber's very partial data sharing. Like Uber's, AVs will represent a viable business model only by running on our public streets. Sharing full data would seem to be a small price to pay for that privilege. So here's my favorite rule, near and dear to this crowd, I would hope. Don't buy any urban vision that forgets urbanism. If you study modern urban history, you will see that every major transportation advance has brought with it whole new concepts of what the city is. We are a creative species, and we can't help but use any excuse to reinvent the human habitat. The problem is that all these inventions, from Le Corbusier's Tower in the Park to Frank Lloyd Wright's Broadacre City, have turned out to make our lives worse, and we have to come crawling back from them. What works best for humans is the traditional city of blocks, streets, and squares. It has survived largely unchanged for millennia, and for good reason. Traditional urbanism was not an invention, but evolved naturally in response to human needs, and the adoption of AVs should not be allowed to replace it with something different. I'm going to return to this image from Ford, which discusses the improved walkability of the AV-enabled city. You know I wrote the book on walkability, and if you think about it, you'll probably agree that nobody willingly walks on empty, windswept highway overpasses. Similarly, zooming into the middle of this image, nobody walks, here barely visible in the center, between boring trees and a 6-lane highway. This is where people walk, and it hasn't changed in 3,000 years. We can't let AVs trick us into thinking anything different. Rule number 9, unify around set policy demands. Admittedly, a message for mayors, but I think we all need to support it. As we wind up this list, let's move forward into action. As I've suggested, there are a number of ways that cities will need to regulate AVs if they are to be a boon and not a bane. These include owning the data, protecting transit, prohibiting empty, circling trips, setting speed limits, and the like. City by city, each has almost no sway here, especially if they're acting in competition to who can get AVs first, so they can all be cool like Pittsburgh. But working together, cities can all create a protocol that they present to AV providers as a collective requirement. Such an effort has already begun at NACTO, the National Association of City Transportation Officials. They have some sway, but they don't own the streets like cities do. The NACTO list of requirements is a very good start, but it needs refinement and expansion. That's why I recommended to the US Conference of Mayors that they take this on by establishing a task force on AVs, and I'm still bullish on that happening. Finally, here's where I had a little fun. Rule 10, invest now in the current technological revolution. It's not often that a city planner gets to give advice or got to give advice to 200 mayors at once, so I couldn't resist bringing up what I call the biggest city planning revolution currently underway in only some American cities. It's a transportation revolution, and it's upon us now rather than in 2030 or beyond like AVs. Here's what I said. What if I were to tell you that there was a transportation technology available now that outperformed AVs by almost every measure, that traveled 50 to 80 times further per calorie expended than the automobile, that required very little space, that could drive on existing infrastructure with minimal modification, that didn't pollute, that made its users healthier, happier, and skinnier? Well, ladies and gentlemen, that technology exists, and more than half of you own it already. It's called a Yay, and while the bicycle is not new, what is new to the US is a whole bunch of great new bike infrastructure, like the protected bike lane, that has been shown to be much more effective than conventional bike lanes at growing cycling populations. Isn't this great? When a protected bike lane was inserted in Brooklyn's Prospect Park West, the number of cyclists tripled, speeding went from 75% of all users to 17% of all users, injury crashes went down 63%, and car volume and trip times were unchanged. And I see people taking a picture, so I'll pause. You can take your picture. There were no negative impacts on the road's capacity, which is fascinating, even though it lost a lane. There was, of course, a lawsuit, this being New York, but eventually the bike-hating NIMBY trolls grudgingly surrendered to reality. Protected bike lanes are what you need. Protected bike lanes are what you need to give a sense of security to the civilian bicyclist. And this crowd will forgive me, but without them, all you get is mammals, the middle-aged men in Lycra. With them, you get millennials, you get tech companies, you get these folks here, or this guy in Seattle, and I can't tell you how happy I am to be in a city that's showing some real progress in that regard. And yes, I follow Dong Ho Chang on Twitter. But you can't get lazy, because with a lot of good bike lanes, you can become Copenhagen, where 4 times as many people bike than drive. And we're talking about autonomous vehicles. Why? By this point, I hope it's clear that autonomous vehicles are the right answer to the wrong question. Why do we all, even MIT's Media Lab and Google, keep asking how we can make cars better? Where has that question ever gotten us? The proper question is, how can we provide the most useful mobility to the most people with the most positive outcomes for society? The answer includes cars, but also includes trains, buses, bikes, and walking, especially biking and especially walking. If you've seen me speak before, you know most of my talks are about that. So thank you for listening.